Okay, welcome to day 2 of the Pax Christi USA National Conference. My name is Stephen. I am the National Field Organizer for Pax Christi USA. I'm going to briefly outline the plans for the day, and then I'll turn it over to Marie and Lauren. We will have a plenary session panel with Jordan Denari Duffner, Ruben Garcia, and Cynthia Bailey Manns, and the topic is being a prophetic church in a time of polarization and conflict. Our session will run until about 1:30 Eastern Time. It'll be moderated by the 2024 Peace Pair, Marie Dennis, who is a 2022 Teacher of Peace, Ambassador of Peace, Senior Director of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and Lauren Bailey, Pax Christi Young Adult and former National Field Organizer, who was a great help to me when I first came on about 7 months ago. Following the plenary session, we will have a break and then breakout sessions. One breakout session will be held from 1 to 3 p.m. It's called Mary at the Foot of the Cross. It's a virtual retreat on the death penalty and restorative justice. Since this begins at 1 o'clock, everyone is reminded to exit this session. You should get a link from Michelle Sherman allowing you to do that. All other breakout sessions will be from 2:30 to 3:45. You chose one or more breakout sessions when you registered, and most of them will be recorded. And they'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel following the conference. There'll be a 50-minute break from about 1:30 to 2:20. We ask you to return about 2:20 to prepare for the 2:30 breakout sessions. And there will also be a 4 o'clock networking session. There's also an opportunity to talk about taking particular actions. The day will close with a mass that will start at 4:30. It will include the Teacher of Peace Award ceremony, and it will conclude by 5:30. So I'm going to ask you to be sure that your mics are muted, and I'm going to turn it over to Marie Dennis and Lauren Bailey. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Stephen. As Stephen shared, Marie and I are a peace pair in the 2024 to 2025 cohort, and we are so honored to be sharing some space with incredible panelists today, Jordan, Ruben, and Cynthia, in conversation. Today's panel will explore a few central questions the church is being called to respond to. How does the church respond to atrocities in Palestine? What is the church's role in addressing immigration? And what are the impacts of the Synod in the United States? I will pass it to Marie, who will share a little bit about the flow of our session.
Oh, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be with you all. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Stephen. So each of our panelists will have 10 to 15 minutes to begin a reflection on how their experience, how their expertise relates to Pax Christi's work, and especially to our theme this weekend. After our 3 guests speak, we will continue the conversation among the panelists and in response to your questions.
Thanks, Marie. Perfect. So to start off today's panel of esteemed speakers, I want to introduce and bring to the Zoom stage Jordan Denari Duffner, who will start our conversation. Jordan Denari Duffner is a theologian and scholar of Muslim-Christian relations and interfaith dialogue. She will speak on the role of the church in addressing the ongoing crisis in Israel and Palestine. Thanks, Jordan.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren and Marie and everyone at Pax Christi for the invitation. I'm so glad to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm going to share some images while I talk to sort of ground the conversation. So let me do that quickly and then I'll begin. I'm going to do it like this. Okay. Are you all able to see that? Could someone just nod? Wonderful. So I want to begin our time together with these images. Recently, I became Facebook friends with some of the pastoral staff at the only Catholic church in Gaza, the Holy Family Parish. They house many Christians, including the Catholic population in Gaza right now, when people had to flee their homes from Israeli bombing, which started last year. Many of them took refuge in the Holy Family Church in Gaza. Some of you have also probably heard that earlier this year, 2 Christian women were actually shot and killed by Israeli snipers on the compound. Well, every day, one of the staff members posts photos of the day's liturgies on Facebook. So there's images of folks praying the rosary and going to mass. And the photographer, I didn't include these photos in the samples here, but he'll take really up close shots of the attendees. And so it's the same people who come to these services most days. And so these faces have become really familiar to me, the priests, the altar servers, some of the sisters and the parishioners. And not all of these people are Palestinian. The pastor and the sisters and some others in the community are not actually from Gaza. They're not Palestinian, but they've committed to staying with their Palestinian brothers and sisters amid the violence. And I share these, one, to connect us back to the church in the Holy Land and in Gaza. And I wish more Catholics in the United States had the opportunity to see these photos of our fellow Catholics and Christians who oftentimes, I think, go forgotten when we think about what's going on in Israel-Palestine. Of course, there's so many other images that are coming through our social media feeds these days of people suffering, of people experiencing extreme violence. I also think that many in our American church are not seeing these images, and so they're not aware of the degree of suffering that is going on. But I think these images are such a testament to the faithfulness of Palestinians under the current violence. One of the Arabic terms that comes to mind is sabr, or patient forbearance, that both Christians and Muslims in Gaza are really exhibiting right now. So I've been asked to speak about how our response as U.S. Catholics to the crisis in Palestine can be an opportunity for unity for Catholics. And I really liked when Pax Christi reached out and framed the issue this way, because usually Israel-Palestine is framed as, I think, a divisive issue in U.S. politics or in the world globally. And so I want to talk for a few minutes about how our activism on behalf of a just peace in Israel-Palestine has, one, been a source of unity within our faith community, how different Catholic and Christian groups have been coming together in recent months. I also want to talk about how this work builds unity and interfaith solidarity with people beyond our faith tradition. And then I also want to briefly talk about how this activism helps us better live out our Catholic values, and specifically Catholic social teaching. So I'll talk about some of the initiatives that I and many of the other folks in this room have been up to since, especially since October of last year. So since October 7th of last year, there have been a number of Washington, D.C. based and national actions led by a group called the Christians for Ceasefire Coalition. This group came about in kind of a ad hoc way after October 7th and after Israel's bombing in Gaza. And the coalition has been hosting prayer vigils and masses outside the White House, calling for President Biden, our fellow Catholic, to live up to our Catholic values and conform with them. And so we've been asking for really specific policy actions like a ceasefire, permanent and lasting and immediate, of course, release of all hostages and political prisoners, humanitarian aid in Gaza, and also that the U.S. consider restricting or conditioning weapons to Israel. And so, as you can see in the photos, these are some of the different actions that have been happening over the last year. Some of these photos are actually taken by Judy at Pax Christi, so want to give her credit for those. But you can see we've got Catholics and Christians and people of other faiths assembling together, making these public statements, and then trying to translate that into action in other ways as well. There have been also some really moving interfaith actions and also some solidarity trips to Israel, the West Bank, and even the border with Gaza. That's where this photo was taken. This photo was taken a couple weeks ago, I believe, with an interfaith delegation. Some of you who were there might actually be in the Zoom room right now. And this is just one example of the interfaith solidarity that Christians have been involved in on behalf of a just and lasting peace in the Holy Land. And what I think is really important about highlighting actions like this is that it demonstrates that Christians and Muslims and Jews are not all on different sides of this conflict. I think sometimes we frame this conflict is framed as a Muslim-Jewish conflict. But instead, I think we're seeing people who share common values come together on the side of peace and justice. And so I think elevating those stories right now is really important. I'm also a member of the Catholic Advisory Council of Churches for Middle East Peace. Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP, is a Washington, D.C. based organization, was founded about 40 years ago to help engage American Christians to push for just policies in the Holy Land, or in the Middle East broadly, but specifically in Israel, Palestine. Well, this Catholic Advisory Council that I was invited to join formed about 3 years ago. I joined back in 2022. And our mission as this sort of Catholic subgroup is to educate and engage Catholics on Israel-Palestine. And so we were doing some of this work before October 7th of last year, but our work has really accelerated since then. And so I just want to tell you about a couple of the things that we've been up to alongside, again, many of the partners in this room. So last year, in late October, the Catholic Advisory Council already had planned a breakout session on the crisis in Israel-Palestine at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. Many of you will be familiar with this annual gathering hosted by the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And it draws a lot of Catholic school students, both high school and college, former Jesuit volunteers, many others in the Catholic community, to think about how our faith informs our approach to different social justice issues. And because Israel-Palestine was in the news in a new way, and in kind of an unprecedented way, we had so much interest, particularly among Catholic young people, to learn about what's going on in the Holy Land, not just in the current moment, but the historical injustices that are persisting. And they want to do something. They wanted an outlet. They wanted to raise their voices. Many of them are doing events or activities on their local campuses, but people wanted a way to raise their voices and push for change. And so one of the results of that was a Catholic sign-on letter on Israel-Palestine that was co-sponsored by CMEP's Catholic Advisory Council, Pax Christi, the Franciscan Action Network, and Maryknoll Office of Global Concern. And what we wanted to do was give Catholics an outlet for their energy and for their concern around the situation in the Holy Land right now. And we also hoped that the letter would also be a tool for Catholics to learn and unlearn some of their to learn about what's going on in the Holy Land, but then also to unlearn some of the stereotypes or some of the misinformation that many, I think, American Christians, Americans broadly have about the Israel-Palestine conflict. So we released this letter in May of this past year and received over 6,000 individual signatures from Catholics, many of whom were very prominent individuals, again, some people in this room. And then we also had Catholic organizations signing on in the hundreds. And so it was really a groundswell of Catholics who I think in some ways were speaking up for the first time on this issue. Unfortunately, many of the demands that we were asking for in the letter, particularly directed at the White House and the US government, have not yet been made reality. But I think that the letter still had it was still very impactful because, again, it was the first time that I think Catholics have raised our voice in in a collective way on this issue, particularly lay people. And I just want to give Judy Code at Pax Christi a shout out, because she was very instrumental in the rollout of this, and the letter campaign would not have been nearly as successful if without her involvement. I'm happy to share more about the contents of the letter in our later discussion if folks would like. But the last thing I just want to bring to folks' attention, and we can talk about this more later too, is the work that myself and my co-author of the letter, Julie Schumacher-Cohen, have been doing on connecting Catholic social teaching to the situation in Israel-Palestine. So we draw on the principles of Catholic social teaching to help Catholics better understand what's going on through the lens of our faith, and to help motivate a response that honors the life and dignity of all people. So I'll leave things there, but I look forward to remaining in conversation with all of you throughout the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Jordan. That was so many questions that we have in mind to ask you, and we will get back to that, but thank you so much. It is now my great honor to introduce Ruben Garcia. Ruben is Pax Christi USA's 2012 Teacher of Peace, and as many of you will know, is the Executive Director of Annunciation House in El Paso. Ruben will speak about the Church's role in addressing immigration. Welcome, Ruben. Thank you for being with us.
Could you unmute yourself, Ruben? Sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mary Dennis. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Pax Christi, for the invitation, for the opportunity to join you today for this gathering. I'm very grateful for the inclusion of the word prophetic in the title for today's session, and really for this weekend gathering, this conference that is being held virtually. I've been working with refugees for many years, and as I was thinking about my comments and what I would be sharing with you today, something that comes to mind is a good number of years ago, I was asked to speak to a group of pastors. This was an ecumenical group of pastors, primarily Christian pastors, who were visiting the border, and they asked if they could visit Annunciation House and if I would join them and share with them. And there must have been maybe 30, 40 pastors of different churches in different parts of the United States. And when the question and answer session part of the time together came up, one of the things that started to be shared from pastors was the incredible difficulty that they experience in being able to speak with their congregations in regards to immigration. And I remember, and I will always remember, this priest who had been the pastor of a church for like 15, 16 years. And you could tell by the way that he was speaking that he was actually in pain about what his reality with his parish was. And he spoke about loving the people in his parish, his community, who he has shepherded for many years. And at the same time, the pain that he felt, because he felt a real calling to become more involved with the issue of the refugees, the immigrants that are entering the United States and have been entering really throughout the entire history of the United States. And the pushback that he would get from his parishioners who would come up with him and say, "Father, we really would appreciate it if you would stick to the gospel. Please don't bring politics. Don't bring politics into the discussion." And he was sharing with a group how consistently he was rebuffed with his effort to try and speak about what the gospel calls us to do in the face of all of the refugees that are arriving from south of the border, basically from Mexico and the Central American countries, and now South American countries as well, and how he could not make headway with his own community. His community kept blocking him, so to speak. Other pastors then shared similar experiences, how difficult it is, that immediately there is this tendency to want to put it within the category of politics. And indeed, that is the reality that we face today, that the church is having a very difficult time walking down the path of the gospel in the midst of the political environment in which we find ourselves. And then church communities find themselves torn apart. They find themselves as divided as our political society is in the United States today over multiple issues. And it's made it very, very difficult for people to experience any semblance of unity, togetherness, a sense of common endeavor. And that has infiltrated our churches, and it's become very, very difficult. What is part of this as well, and there happened to be a Lutheran bishop that was part of this group, and he spoke about the difficulty as a bishop in trying to shepherd his Lutheran priest for the same reason, and even the separation, the division that exists among the hierarchy when we get into these topics. And I think that when we speak about immigration and the role of the church, I think that the word prophetic is particularly important, because we like to pretend that there is a sense of unity when in fact that unity is still absent, that unity is still lacking. And that's a challenge for us as a believing community. That's a challenge for us as we look at our respective roles as lay people, as religious, as clergy, as bishops, that the truth is that we are also quite divided. And part of that prophetic voice is to call out each other in acknowledgement that we have splintered, and it's become very, very difficult. We get calls from the local hospitals when they're ready to discharge. By coincidence, today is an example of that. We've got a call from one of our local hospitals that they've got a family there from El Salvador. Mom just gave birth, and the newborn is going to be in the NICU for several days. This is a very, very common occurrence. In this case, it's a newborn, it's a family. It can just as easily be, and in fact, more frequently it is, individual refugees who have fallen off the 30-foot wall that has been built to separate Mexico and the United States, and refugees climb that wall, and when they're coming down, they fall and they fracture their ankles, their legs, their hips, they fracture their skulls, and end up in the hospital. And some of those individuals, when they're transported, they haven't been processed by Border Patrol, because they're injured, they're seriously injured. An ambulance is called, they're transported to a hospital where they receive what can often be life-saving treatment. And once surgeries, limbs have been set, hips have been tended to, we get a call asking us, will we now receive this refugee? And 99% of the time we say to the hospital, we will, and we receive these refugees. As I said, some of these have not been processed. Annunciation House right now finds itself in the midst of a struggle with the state of Texas over receiving refugees like that who haven't been processed, who, the state attorney general refers to as that they're undocumented and they're being trafficked and they're being smuggled because they haven't been processed. The church is imminently in the midst of this discussion because that's where the gospel is. I remember when the numbers of refugees arriving was much higher. There was a point where we were asking faith communities in different cities in the United States, and those included Omaha, Kansas City, it included Denver, it included Dallas. And these were faith communities that had said, yes, we're willing to receive a bus of refugees that had been processed by Border Patrol and then released. And because the hospitality site network was being strained in its ability to handle the numbers, they were saying, we are willing to receive a busload. And I remember very clearly sending a bus to Denver. And once the bus arrived, I get a phone call from one of the church leaders, and she was literally in tears. And her tears were, Ruben, I've been a member of my church for like 50 years. And this is the first time in my life that I have felt my faith come truly alive. When I see these families coming down from the bus, something happens in my heart, something happens in my spirit, in my soul that I've never experienced. People are continually asking, what is it that we can do in the face of this tremendous turmoil over immigration? And time and again, I say to people, consider hosting, consider offering hospitality. And don't worry about getting caught in the middle of the push and pull of the discussion that is going on, but rather simply find a few other people and take the step to begin to consider hosting a family as a faith community, whether it's in San Francisco, whether it's in Boise, Idaho, whether it's in Omaha, Nebraska, Atlanta, Georgia, wherever. Begin the process of reflecting and contemplating on the gospel call, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Don't worry about whether or not you have your entire faith community, your entire church with you. Simply take the step and begin to live out that spirit that the woman in Dallas spoke about in her own life as she experienced the arrival of that bus. I think it's very, very significant that after Pope Francis was named the next pontiff of the Catholic Church worldwide, the very first trip that Pope Francis took outside of the Vatican after he had been named Pope, the very first trip was to the town of Lampedusa in Italy, which is historically known as one of the places where the boats of refugees have been arriving and continue to arrive. And he went to Lampedusa to lend his person, his role now as the Pope of the Universal Church, to say, this is where the church is supposed to be. And he addressed the villagers in Lampedusa, and he acknowledged how difficult it is to offer hospitality, how easily it is to be overwhelmed by the numbers. And I speak of that as one who has experienced that here on the border in El Paso, that the numbers categorically can be overwhelming. They can burn you out, the sheer numbers of it. And yet, I can think of no other experience that is more life-giving in terms of our faith than that of being involved in the experience of hosting the refugee, the immigrant. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben, for sharing about your witness at Annunciation House and for your call to action in radical hospitality. Next up, I want to introduce Dr. Cynthia Bailey Manns. Cynthia is the Director of Adult Learning at St. Joan of Arc in Minneapolis and one of 4 laypersons from the U.S. participating in the Synod on Synodality. Cynthia will speak on the impact of the Synod in the United States. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you today to talk about this important topic of being a prophetic church during this time of polarization and conflict. Ecclesia Semper Reformata. The Spirit is always reforming and renewing the church. When I was appointed to the Synod, I knew I would be transformed, yet I was uncertain how. Once there, we were quickly immersed in synodality, in communion with people from all over the world, being Catholic in different and alike ways. I experienced synodality as a way of being a prophetic church, listening to the Holy Spirit, the protagonist, as we, the faithful, journey together. We are required to honor the baptismal dignity of all of the people of God. During our delegate Synod preparation, we were reminded that the purpose of the Synod is not to produce documents, but to plant dreams, draw forth prophecies and visions, allow hope to flourish, inspire trust, bind up wounds, weave together relationships, awaken a dawn of hope, learn from one another, and create a bright resourcefulness that will enlighten minds, warm hearts, give strength to our hands. Once in Rome, our spiritual retreat grounded us in spiritual practices of prayer and silence, and dwelling in the presence of God and the sacredness of one another. Our retreat spiritual director, Father Radcliffe, reminded us that we preach the gospel of friendship that reaches across boundaries. So the foundation of all we shall do in this Synod shall be the friendships we create. It does not look like much. It will not make headlines in the media. They came all the way to Rome to make friends. What a waste. But it is by friendship that we will make a transition from I to we. During our time together, our community embodied our commitment to communion and healing through the spiritual practices of sacred presence, empathetic listening, and thoughtful discernment manifested in the conversations in the Spirit. These spiritual conversations were intentionally welcoming, inclusive, and affirming sacred encounters, grounded in prayer and silence. This sacred space was an invitation to be present to the Holy Spirit, the protagonist, who challenges us to come together with a commitment to individually and in community, be present to one another through prayer, deep listening, respectful dialogue, opening our hearts to one another, and discernment, as we shared our concerns about and dreams for our church. As we engaged in the conversations, we were committed to creating space within ourselves for God to open our ears, minds, and hearts to new understandings and responses to the different life experiences of others. Within our sacred container of prayer and silence, we created brave space to listen to the Holy Spirit and for I to become we. In this space, we continually encountered God and one another. In this sacred space, God's beloved community moved beyond the initial stage of being a welcoming community to an inclusive community where people felt they belonged. and accompanied on their spiritual journey. This process was critical to discernment as it allowed us to be vulnerable, honest, and work together as a group. All shared, all were respectfully listened to. We acknowledged commonalities, tensions, and new questions that drew us into communal discernment. We leaned into Pope Francis's words. The Holy Spirit always surprises us to suggest fresh paths and new ways of speaking. It is a slow and perhaps tiring exercise, this learning to listen to one another, bishops, priests, religious, and laity, all the baptized, and to avoid artificial and shallow and prepackaged responses. Let us not soundproof our hearts. Let us not remain barricaded in our certainties. We can easily forget that we are one big family, God's family. When the world around us is deeply polarized, it can be difficult to behave in a way that confirms our interconnectedness. It is easy to feel hopeless when we are constantly reminded that we live in a fractured society and our humanity does not recognize, honor, and protect the human dignity and freedom of all human beings. Yet, despite the suffering we feel in our bodies, minds, and spirits, we must have faith and hope in God and each other. Last year's Synod focused on the question, how does a synodal church describe itself? This year's Synod focuses on the questions, how to be a synodal church in mission, how to engage in deep listening and dialogue, how to be co-responsible in the light of the dynamism of our personal and communal baptism vocation, how to transform structures and processes so that all may participate and share the charisms that the Spirit pours out on each from the common good, and how to exercise power and authority as service. The Synod working document also emphasizes an important reality of journeying together in synodality. At every stage of the synodal process, the need for healing, reconciliation, and restoration of church trust within the church and society resonated strongly. Walking this path of healing and restoration is a missionary commitment of the people of God in our world and a gift we must invoke from above. The desire to walk further on this path is a fruit of the synodal process. I believe most of us have encountered woundedness within our church, where healing, reconciliation, and restoration of trust are needed. Addressing these wounds requires honesty, humility, patience, vulnerability, creativity, risk-taking, and faith. And most importantly, it requires us to co-create processes for healing and reconciliation with those harmed. Being a synodal church is sacred, messy work that calls us to individual and community transformation. It contains limitless invitations to embody God's empathetic love with one another. It is full of laughter and wonder and curiosity. And as part of the universal church, our journey together requires us to embody God's empathetic love far beyond the physical boundaries of our congregations and ministries. God calls us to honor the sacredness and dignity of each person. Caring for, serving, and loving others reveals not who they are, but who we are. As Christians, we must be unified in our responsibility to love and care for others and all creation as we are cared for and loved by God. When we do this, we live out our shared faith through our actions in service to the world. This is the work of a nonviolent church. I will close with words of wisdom from my spiritual companion accompanying me on the Synod journey, Sister Thea Bowman. People are looking for sources of hope, courage, and strength. I think all of us in the church are supposed to be that kind of person for each other. I pray that our hearts continue to be open to one another's life experiences as we honestly acknowledge the challenges and gifts of today's church. Thank you for your presence on our sacred synodal journey together.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing about your experience at the Synod and those planted dreams that you talked about with the church. As you were talking, I just feel immense hope and gratitude knowing that your voice is present at the Synod. So thank you for spending time with us today as well. Perfect. Before we jump into questions from the crowd, which I would just remind everybody, if you have any questions that popped up as you were hearing the speakers share, feel free to send those in the chat, and Marie and I will sift through those and try to get to as many as we can before the cutoff in the next 45 minutes or so. But before we get to that, I wanted to create some space here for our panelists. If there's anything that you heard from the fellow speakers, that you have any reactions or comments that you would want to add to or ask one another. And we can go in whatever order. Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in with those.
I'm happy to share first. I was struck by the quote you shared at the end, Cynthia, about how each of us needs to be the source of hope for each other right now. And, you know, I have been immensely sort of bolstered by the work that other Catholics are doing when it comes to the issue that I've been focusing on and talked about today on Israel-Palestine. For example, I couldn't go to the on the solidarity trip to the Holy Land with some of the other Catholics and Christians who did, but the fact that they went was the source of so much hope. And I think, you know, when each of us, I think, feels sort of inadequate in what we're doing, we know that other people are doing something, and that's, you know, that's all we can really ask for, I guess. And then I just also wanted to react to something that Ruben said about the woman who had just given birth and the folks who are injured and in the hospital from their journey. And just some of it sounds so similar to, again, the things that we're seeing out of Gaza. You know, I've read so many stories and heard so many stories about mothers and children who are suffering. And just, again, the suffering of human life, you know, regardless of the issue, just we can see the connections, I guess. And it means that all of the things that each of us are doing are connected and are really important, I think.
And I'll jump in and say, Jordan, deeply grateful for your conversation and information regarding this important issue. I know at St. John's, we are looking at many different ways on how to be involved in getting information and then how to be supportive. And so I will tap more into your work to see where we can jump in. And Ruben, the immigration is such an important issue for us. We have parishioners who go down to various different borders all year long. So we understand the challenge and the intensity and the absolute necessity that we as Catholics live into our Catholic social teaching and be supporters of, you know, enriching the lives of those who come to us for help. And so thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us.
A pleasure indeed. I, you know, was crossing my mind as I was listening to you, Cynthia, and I was listening to Jordan as well, that it would be good for us to remember the incredible history of activism that is part of the Catholic Church, and the extent to which the Catholic Church in the United States has been a key instrument for bringing about changes that have to do with basic social justice within the United States, and then, of course, as how we view the rest of the world. in times of war, in times of civil unrest in the United States. As I think of the work that is being done with the Senate right now, and especially as Jordan also quoted there, your comments toward the end when you speak about the modeling of what we want to be for each other as we go forward, and I think that's key to all of this. As I'm thinking of individuals who ask, what is it that we can do? And obviously there's some concrete, tangible things that we can do. I think I would include within that to spend some time learning about the history of the activism of Catholics throughout the United States. And sometimes that activism was a very, very lonely path that individual Catholics took in living out their faith and their understanding of their faith. But I think that would inspire people to ask themselves how often it is that I wait for others before I feel empowered and in a sense authorized to take steps on my own. So I think that looking back over our history is a very helpful exercise for all of us.
That's a great point, and thank you all for continuing that conversation. I hope you will jump in with your own thoughts and comments. But I was struck by the thread of two threads that I thought wove through your three initial presentations. One of them was the importance of telling the stories, of getting to know the people themselves. I both in thinking about what's been happening in Palestine and Israel, what has been happening on the border and all along the migrant route, knowing, as you said, Ruben, encouraging people to consider hosting an immigrant, a migrant. I think it's about knowing the stories, hearing them correctly. And I've been struck over time at how the stories that the migrants tell and live out, and the stories that we've seen in Palestine and Israel are often stories about nonviolence in action. Sometimes that's not obvious. Sometimes it's missed. Often the stories are distorted, so it's hard to see the nonviolence in action. But I'm very encouraged, Cynthia, by your reference to the synodal process as a nonviolent process, because I think it is one way that the church is acting in a prophetic role that encourages all of us to imagine a different way of seeing reality and of acting. And I just would be interested in any of your thoughts about any of you, and maybe especially Cynthia, about the visibility or the reality of nonviolence present in the work that you're doing, beginning perhaps at the Synod, and then if the others would also comment on that, it would be great.
Yeah, you cannot be prepared. I mean, I was a little prepared of what I would encounter at the Synod, but you can't fully know until you're in the midst of it. So think of a room every day for almost 30 days of being surrounded by over 400 people, most of them from other countries, some of them not speaking English. And we are tasked with journeying together to talk about topics to put forth for the Pope to consider for the future of the church. And it requires us to be open to listening to the sacred stories and life experiences of people that are totally different from mine, all under the lens of our Catholic faith. So I was in groups with over 45 people from different countries. Our commonality was that we all spoke English. So I was in all English groups. But that also meant that whatever topic we were talking about, there was more than my point of view. And so that, opened my eyes of being present to others and seeing things differently based upon their truth, their valid life experiences. At St. John's, every Sunday in Mass, we do a peace prayer, and then we sit about 45 seconds in silence in pretty much total darkness. And that took on a total new meaning for me when I was at the Senate because the war broke out. And we had delegates from Ukraine and from Gaza and from Palestine. We had Israel. We had all of those. And we had 22 other countries currently at war with delegates in our session. So that changed the impact of peace and war for me to a depth that I had not experienced. And so when you're in that space, and I think it's the Holy Spirit just kind of needling us and truly being the protagonist, we are required, and we made a commitment to listen to the Spirit and to listen to each other in a way that was respectful and deep listening and being present, and to lean into silence and prayer. And so it is the sacred story, that the sacred stories are the container for this nonviolent work.
Thank you, Cynthia. That feels so important. It leads me to ask a specific question to Jordan, but feel free to respond in any direction that you'd like, Jordan. One of the questions that was in the chat that made me think of the challenge that Cynthia was describing at the Synod was, how do we relate to our Zionist brothers and sisters? How do you do that? How do we use an opportunity to break through the divisions?
Yeah, I think, and first of all, I want to acknowledge that when we talk about Zionism as an ideology, it can mean lots of different things to different people. And so I think, first of all, it's really important to clarify if we're in conversation or dialogue with someone who identifies that way, first ask them what they mean by it, because there are many like liberal or cultural Zionists, so to speak, who would advocate for equal rights and dignity for Palestinians. It's not all Zionism is the brand of the Israeli government or of Christian Zionists in the U.S., like groups like Kufi and things like that. Now, of course, that exists, and I think among Catholics, there's not a conscious theological Zionism like there might be in some evangelical communities. I think a lot of American Catholics have just absorbed this sense of the U.S. needing to be an ally of Israel, just because we're sort of immersed in this American political system and environment. I don't think people think very critically or even theologically about it oftentimes. But I think, first of all, just sharing the stories of the reality on the ground is hugely important. And, again, with our Catholic sign-on letter, we couldn't get into a ton of details, and obviously we couldn't put faces to these experiences, but we talk about the fact that Palestinians living in the West Bank, for example, are stateless, and in Gaza as well, are stateless. This is not a conflict of two equally matched sides, but this is one population that's being dominated by another and not having they're not being afforded the same rights and dignity as Israeli citizens. And so I think just giving people those facts is really important. When I was at the Ignatian Family Teach-In, I gave some anecdotes and some sort of examples that I think really shook people. And these are things that have been shared by Palestinians, like this idea of the West Bank being sort of like a piece of Swiss cheese, that this is not a Palestinian territory that is, governed by where Palestinians have, the freedom to do as they please and to achieve their their full rights. No, this is a system where Israel is primarily in control and Palestinians have these sort of like pockets of semi-autonomy, but it's always circumscribed and limited in some way. And just giving people those sort of metaphors or those nuggets to have a better sense of what Palestinians are experiencing, I think is helpful. I also think that we also have to lean back on our values and on Catholic social teaching. Again, this idea of, the foundation of Catholic social teaching is the inherent human dignity of all people, regardless of their identity. And so if we're talking to anyone, whether in our faith community, like our Catholic community or outside of it, who has forgotten that, and I think there are strands of Zionism where that has been forgotten. I think just as there are strands of like there are other political ideologies that also obviously forget this basic value. And so I think we have to go back to these values and remind people that these are not just Catholic values. These are values held by Jews, Muslims, people of goodwill, people of other faith traditions. And then people have to, our interlocutors then have to grapple with the fact that their stated values might not actually line up with the political positions that they hold on to or they're advocating. So I think it's in some ways about just laying the facts bare and then letting people go on that journey to maybe be transformed. And maybe that's not in conversation with us. Maybe that happens later or another time.
Thanks so much, Jordan. There have been a handful of questions in the chat that I'm going to try to pull together a little bit, but the common thread, which Jordan, I think you were just speaking to, is how do we grapple with the difference when our faith calls us to act politically? And the question that I'm looking at specifically here is the disconnect that folks are able to have with separating Jesus from his radical activism and organizing work and like the revolutionary Jesus that is sometimes forgotten. So one question that I would ask of folks is, how do we deepen and broaden the understanding using our baptismal call to remind folks in our faith of the radical Jesus that we're following and kind of what that means for our advocacy and organizing?
As I was listening to Jordan speak right now, one of the thoughts that kept going through my mind is the use of the word undocumented, and how that word is used to label an entire group of people in a way that it denies them a place at the table. I've often asked myself, I've often asked a lot of groups, that when we speak about immigration, what would that conversation look like if at the table you had, as Cynthia was speaking, being in that room with 45 individuals from different countries, some of who were from countries that were presently in war, and in that moment, realizing that we all come from such life-altering experiences to the conversation. If we're going to speak about immigration and we find ourselves in a room with an equal number of undocumented refugees who have just crossed, and we start opening that discussion, what might that discussion sound like? What might that discussion look like? How difficult is it for us to concede to other people, as you just mentioned right now, to concede to them, to attribute to them the same level of dignity and equality that we extend to other people because they were born in the United States. And of course, that's not how the gospel defines it. That's not how the gospel approaches it. When you speak of the radical Jesus, the revolutionary Jesus, what makes Jesus revolutionary is that Jesus never was held back by the rules and regulations that we come up over time as societies that we then in turn use to discredit or disempower other groups of people. And this is perhaps the greatest challenge that I find in speaking with people in churches, et cetera. This tendency to say, well, they're illegal, and therefore they have no voice, or they shouldn't have voice, or they're somehow less than we who are citizens of this country. And when you look at that, when you listen to that, and you ask, is that the Jesus you know? And then there's this silence, this incredible silence.
Mm. Don't want to jump in if you wanted to respond as well, Jordan or Cynthia.
Yeah, I was just going to say that at our parish, we always ask the question, is this good trouble we need to be engaged in? And the answer is always yes. And so if we're following our Catholic social teaching and we're following the teaching of Jesus, and we not only have an obligation, we have the responsibility to do it. And so we use that as one of the foundational groundings for what we do, how we serve in the healing of the world.
That's great. It's beautiful. So we are all heading into a major election. I think we're all aware of it. It's all around us. A question, how can we be, or how would you call us to be, both prophetic in the political arena without being partisan? What's your advice for Catholic voters as we move toward November? How do we approach the challenging, often conflictive reality that we'll be facing? What's your advice from your experience and your perspective?
I can begin. I think the issue of Israel-Palestine doesn't leave American voters with an easy choice in terms of our two-party system right now. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the Democratic Party has been deeply disappointing to those of us who are concerned about the rights and dignity of Palestinians, and also changing U.S. policy toward Israel. And so there are many people who, would like to, whether or not they're Catholic, would like to vote Democrat, in the upcoming election, but are really feeling like, because of the Biden administration, and then because of where Kamala Harris has indicated that her policy will go, they're really not sure where this leaves them in terms of voting and who to support in November. So again, I think in terms of Israel-Palestine, it's not really a partisan issue in the same way that some of these other issues might be. Or it's not as clear cut, I guess, about, if you were a single issue voter on one of these issues, like you would know which party to vote for. But I think it's just about being consistent and calling out, when we're talking about Israel-Palestine, whether it's on the Republican side or on the Democratic side, calling out and calling for change, regardless of the party that is advocating for harmful policies. Because I think, well, I'll just leave it there. But I think it's a challenge for folks who want to vote their conscience on this issue in this election.
Yeah, Ruben or Cynthia, what do you think? What would you say to voters facing the election?
Well, one of the things that I would say is I wish there were other choices. In one sense, the election for me can be simple, in that I have to ask myself, when I look at what are the values that are being affirmed by the different candidates out there. It becomes easier for me to ask myself the question as I reflect on my faith, which of these individuals reflect more closely what I understand my faith to be calling me to, and then proceed from that. I think that we need to be careful in phrasing questions, because in phrasing the question, we sometimes concede the premise of the question, that is there a way to recommend to people how to proceed? And the truth of it is that both parties right now leave a lot to be desired in their ability to politically be able to affirm their values. And that's just the reality in which we live. I go back to Cynthia's comment about finding herself in a room with 45 other people. I wonder if those 45 individuals from countries all over the world, what their success would be in being able to arrive at positions on different issues, because they come from such differing life experiences. And so it makes the political journey difficult. I think that one thing that I would say to voters is, because what I wish was available to me is in a sense maybe not available, that I will disengage. And I would caution that. I would caution that if 45 of us are not able to come to a united statement, a united perspective on an issue, that should not become a reason to disengage, that we must remain engaged, that we must acknowledge our own frailty, because even when we start doing our own examination of conscience, and we look at how we have walked our own journey, and we have to acknowledge the many mistakes or the many failings that have been part of my personal life journey, and to understand that God never at any moment stops loving and embracing me, then so too must that be true as we as a country move forward in making decisions about our political leaders.
Thank you, Ruben. And Cynthia, what can we learn from the synodal process that will help us move toward a difficult, challenging election this year?
Yes, that good old conversation in the spirit. Thank you, Ruben, for what you said. Because usually if you're sitting in a group talking about a topic with people from all over the world with different life experiences, it is hard to reach consensus. So what we do is we acknowledge where we can agree. We acknowledge the tension. We acknowledge the questions that we want to continue to get answers to. And then we decide where is there common ground where we can move forward. And I think that's really important, is that it is rare that there is, particularly in an election, where you're going to agree on everything from either candidate. And so we just got our St. Joan of Arc buttons this last week that says Catholics vote for the common good. And so we actually sit down and have a conversation about what is that from our lens as a Catholic community of faith, and how do we reflect that in our ministries, and how is that calling us to vote at the ballot box? We don't tell anybody to vote. We ask them for them to do their own discernment in their examination of conscience. So
thank you all.
Yes, thank you all. I'm going to pull from a little bit of a question that Sister Rose Therese Nolta asked in the chat here. So I think in all of these spaces, whether it's at the Synod or in conversations around Israel and Palestine, or in conversations around the immigration crisis, as you all have named, we've seen so much polarization and divisiveness sometimes. So in all of these, she writes that it's hard to keep up hope in relationships and is searching for a little bit of tips or guidance on how to deal with these areas creatively and passionately, with respect to hope and how we can be beacons of help.
I'll begin by saying I struggle with this too. It's hard to feel hopeful sometimes. You can feel like you're putting a lot of effort into something and then nothing changes. And I feel that oftentimes. Somebody shared with me, and I have it. I have one of the versions over here. Two quotes recently. One from I'm going to probably mispronounce his name, Václav Havel, and then another from Thomas Merton about hope. And they both talk about how, I'm just looking at the quote on my wall over here, that we don't do something because we know that it's going to succeed. We do something because we know it's the right thing to do, or that we hope it's the right thing to do. Yeah, I think there's a prayer from Carl Rahner where he says, I think I know what your will is, but I'm really not sure, so I hope I'm following it. And I think there's a caveat there with all of these things, but that we have to have the confidence that and the hope that we're doing something that contributes to what God wills for the human family, and have to be content with that. And it's not easy, but those reminders and quotes have been helpful for me lately, at least.
Thanks so much, Jordan. Ruben or Cynthia, I'm curious if either of you have any tips for finding hope amidst all of the tumultuous natures that we're seeing around us.
So something that I'm very cognitive of is that I am the hope of people who have come before me. And I am at the Senate for, as a result of people who have prayed for this to happen, who have worked for this to happen, and that many of them did not live to see this day, but that didn't stop them from doing to work. So yes, lament, because it is disappointing. It is hard to keep up the energy. It is hard to have faith. So lament individually and in community as you need to. Yet remember to discern what is yours to do, what is mine to do, because I am responsible for doing my work now to pave the way for someone else to come behind me.
Beautiful.
And if I could just piggyback on what Cynthia just said, something that I find very helpful to myself is to keep myself in the context of the timeline of history, and to acknowledge that I am but a speck in that timeline of history, and that's all that I am. The question really is the authenticity of that speck, and as Cynthia said, how authentic of a speck I am able to be in that fleeting moment that my life exists in the context of the timeline of history is going to determine if the specks that come after me are able to build upon me. And so that for me is really helpful, that there will be, just like I am, the speck that has appeared at this particular moment in history, following countless millions before me. And I'm very conscious of the contribution that countless millions have given to us as a world family, to allow us to live the way that we are able to live today with all of its imperfections, and acknowledging that the road ahead is still very, very long, that my task is to be as authentic of a speck as I am able to be in my life that others may be able to build upon it. And that to me is where hope lies.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's all of your thoughts and comments have been very rich. And I also encourage everyone to read through the chat. There's a very interesting conversation going on in response to the input of the three of you. So thank you. One question that we would be interested in hearing a response from each of you might be, how would you encourage individuals within Pax Christi or Friends of Pax Christi or Pax Christi local groups, for example, to take action in response to the issues and concerns and experience that you've shared on this panel? As we think about the theme of this weekend, of this panel, what advice would you give to individuals or local groups in Pax Christi at this point?
On my issue, I think there's a lot of different things that Catholic individuals and groups can do. I think first, reaching out to our elected officials is really important, letting them know what their constituents believe and what kind of policy changes they would like to see. I also don't want to discount the role that that social media and other forms of speaking out can play, whether it's going to a demonstration or sharing information on social media. I think that helps kind of change the culture and inform others. And then I also just think in Catholic communities, again, connecting all of this back to our faith tradition is really important, and the language of our faith tradition. So again, that's why Julie and I put together the piece on Catholic social teaching, because we hope that can be a tool for people. And I can share that in the chat before we log out. Another thing too is there are ways to financially support those who are suffering through donations, but then also through fundraisers. I mean, one of the things that that some parishes do are sell Holy Land products made by Palestinian Christians in the Holy Land that are a really important source of revenue for them, especially while tourism is really suffering. So there's lots of different things that people can do, and it sort of just depends on what people have the capability for.
Thanks, Jordan. Cynthia, Ruben?
So all the things that Jordan, talked about, I agree with. And yet one of the things that I think is really foundational as a sacred activist is that we always remember to have that spiritual grounding, those spiritual practices that sustain us as we do this challenging work. So frankly, we don't burn out. And to remember that when we need to step aside, have faith that someone else will take that space until you're able to come back. I think that's really critical. And there was a question in the chat about where can people send input, personal or organizational, that they want to have somehow connected to the Synod and don't have a way to do that. You can send it to me. And I just put my email in the chat, because anything that I receive, and I ask for this all the time, I read, and I actually take a notebook to the Synod with me so that I have these stories. And when we're talking about a topic, that's what I go to, your stories. And so that's something you can do for me.
That's great. Thank you. Ruben?
I would add, as a starting point, the importance of sitting with truth. We were told that there were several hundred people that signed up to this conference, and that is indicative of the individuals who have found themselves being called to these topics. And so I think that first is that we realize that there are many, many different things that call for our attention. And one of the things that's important is for us to simply sit with truth, to take the time to become more informed individually, as Cynthia was mentioning, our own spiritual space and our own spiritual foundational in taking the time to reflect with that. I think that leads us then to become aware of multiple ways that different organizations, different efforts that require support from people, and I can make choices about, do I want to join this group? Do I want to join that group? Do I want to perhaps financially support this group? Do I want to be part of an effort to take up a collection of items or clothing or whatever? I can take steps to do that. I can choose to become even more involved. For example, in the area of immigration, I can choose to begin to gather people to talk about the possibility of hosting a family as a faith community. I think it starts with sitting with truth, the importance of not simply hearing about an issue and then jumping from that to wanting to act, but rather using the time that's necessary for me to sit with the truth so that I can ground myself, I can inform myself as I take these steps forward. Any one of these issues, and many, many more, are issues that are going to have different perspectives, different opinions, different groups that are advocating for actions that perhaps we could not ever be in favor of. We're going to be able to walk through all of that if we first ground ourselves. And I just consider that critically important.
Fabulous. Thank you. So much to say. Lauren.
Thank you so much. I recognize that we are now up against the end of our time together. So before we turn it over, I do want to just create any space if there's anything that any of our panelists wanted to share and didn't have a chance to. Any final thoughts? We have a few minutes for that, and then I will turn it to Judy.
Just thank you. And I will take my experience of this and these conversations to the Senate with me in 3 weeks. So thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.
I join you in expressing my gratitude for bringing us together, bringing the larger community within the United States, for those that are interested in Palestine immigration, the Senate. I think it's an important forum, an important way to spend our time this morning. Thank you.
And I also wanted to thank folks for some more specific questions that they put to me and to others on this topic in the chat. And if I didn't get a chance to respond to you in the chat, feel free to be in touch with me. If you just Google my name, you'll be able to find a contact form online to reach out. Or you can easily find my email through Pax Christi. So thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be with all of you.
Thank you all so much for your sharing. As Marie named, the chat has been very lively. I think everybody is taking something with them from this conversation that will lead to further action. And I'm just really grateful to have been in this space with all of you.
Me too.
Thanks. So to that end, I'm going to turn it over to Judy, who I think is going to share a special announcement with everybody.
Hello, everybody. I'm just clearing up the page here. Thank you, Marie and Lauren. Great job. And now you can take a little break. So we have a special announcement regarding next year's conference. So next year we're going to be together. And if you just have a little patience with me, I'm going to pull up our special announcement. And just talk amongst yourselves as I find it, as I find the link. And it's very exciting. All right.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fred Thalen from the Pax Christi USA National Council and convener of the Planning Committee for the 2025 Pax Christi USA National Conference, which we're so delighted to announce is going to be held in Detroit, Michigan at the Renaissance Center. And Detroit's been in a period of renaissance for the past recent decades, and we're delighted that Pax Christi is going to come to bring that beautiful Renaissance spirit of peacemaking to Detroit, and we're sure it's going to be a great conference.
Hello, friends. I'm Mary Hannah from Pax Christi, Michigan. And Fred, you're right. It's going to be a great conference. I mean, we've just begun planning, and already there's so much to tell people and share with people about the accommodations and the location and the things that are right around it. But we're kind of pressed for time.
Well, I wonder if there might be a video that could summarize all of the great things of Detroit.
I think you're right. I think there is. Let's see what might be on my media player as we speak.
We're delighted to welcome you to Detroit. It's going to be the last weekend of July in 2025. Mark your calendars, and you'll be receiving updates through the year as the planning evolves for speakers and conferences and all the great things this conference is going to have.
We're really looking forward to hosting this and welcoming you all here and showing you a good time and a spiritual renaissance, as they say. So please start making plans now.
Take care and see you in Detroit.
So thanks, everyone. Let me find my coworker, Stephen. Stephen, you have any final words before we take our break?
Wonderful presentation discussion. Hope is in the air. Take a break till about 2:20, and we will start our breakouts at 2:30. I understand that there's some people who are trying to cross over to the Mary at the Foot at the Cross retreat. We'll continue to try to help you with that if that's something you're dealing with. A number of people have Judy Code as their name. We love Judy and we like seeing many Judys on the call. But you can go to the top right corner of your screen, click on those three dots. It'll give you a drop down. At the very bottom of the drop down is an option to rename. If you click on that, that will allow you to change your name to what your actual name is. If you have any questions about that, I'm willing to try and coach you on that. We'll see you all about 2:20. Thank you.
So feel free to just turn off your video. You can walk away. You can stay logged on. If you want to keep your Zoom open, that's just fine. We're going to pause the recording and step away for an hour, and we'll just come back here in 1 hour, and we'll start moving everybody into our breakout rooms. We're going to beg your patience as we do the breakout rooms in an hour. So I am going to just pause the recording